The invoice was sitting in the stack of mail that had accumulated while I was gone, between a utility bill and a catalog for kitchen supplies I'd never subscribed to, and it took me a moment to understand what it was because the line item description was 3 words that don't normally appear on any invoice you'd expect to find in your own mailbox. Exterior paint application. The invoice was for $12,000, sent from a company called Precision Coat Residential, billed to my name at my address, itemized across 2 pages with materials costs and labor hours broken down by day, a line for disposal fees, a line for primer, and a line called HOA coordination surcharge that was $400 by itself without any explanation of what coordination had occurred or with whom, and at the bottom, in the signature block, where a client authorizes and acknowledges the work, my name had been signed in handwriting that was not mine, had never been mine, and bore no resemblance to any signature I have ever produced in 42 years of signing things. I had not hired anyone to paint my house. I had not asked anyone to paint my house. I had not known my house was being painted because I had been in the hospital for 23 days, admitted through the emergency department on a Friday night after my daughter Camille had found me struggling to breathe and called an ambulance, and what followed was a cardiac event requiring surgery, a recovery that involved 3 weeks of inpatient monitoring and medication adjustment, and a period of physical vulnerability during which the only things occupying my attention were getting better, following instructions, and eventually being well enough to go home. When Camille drove me home from the hospital on a Tuesday morning in late October, the sun was sharp and low, and the maples on Heron Walk had gone fully gold, and I was quietly, privately relieved to be back in the neighborhood I'd lived in for 11 years. Relieved in the way you only feel it after something has reminded you that the ordinary texture of your own street is not guaranteed. I was looking at the trees and thinking about tea and my own bed, and then Camille turned into my driveway and my eyes registered the front of my house, and I felt something entirely different. The color was wrong. The gray-blue I had chosen 7 years earlier, selected with the specific unhurried care of someone who takes these decisions seriously and repainted in that same color 4 years ago, was gone. The house was taupe now, a warm taupe that was a perfectly acceptable color in the abstract, the kind of color that appears in every exterior paint brochure on the most popular page, and which I would have chosen for someone else's house with some confidence, and would never have chosen for mine because I had already chosen, and it had not been this. I sat in the passenger seat looking at it for a moment that stretched longer than a moment. Camille sat quietly beside me, her hands still on the wheel, watching me in her peripheral vision. "Mom," she said, "did you know about this?" I had not known about this. I had been in the hospital. The neighbor who did know about it, and who had, I would eventually establish through a paper trail that took me 4 months to fully assemble, being the organizing force behind the entire operation, was the Millstone Crossing HOA's president, a woman named Paulette Greer, who lived 3 houses down in a colonial revival with white shutters that had been repainted. I noticed in retrospect, once I started paying attention to these things, approximately 1 month before my house was repainted, by a crew in white trucks bearing the name Precision Coat Residential. Let me tell you who Paulette Greer was before I explain what she had done, because understanding the context of our relationship, which was minimal but pointed, is important for understanding why she had apparently decided that a neighbor's hospitalization was an appropriate moment to act on an ongoing aesthetic disagreement she'd been managing through official channels for the better part of 2 years. My name is Dorothea Haynes. I'm a 63-year-old retired librarian, a recent cardiac surgery patient, and a homeowner who selected her house's exterior paint with the specific, unhurried deliberateness of someone who has spent a career organizing information by category and who applied that same methodical care to choosing a color that she genuinely loved and intended to live with for a decade or more. The gray-blue I'd chosen was a Benjamin Moore color in the Slate family, the name of which I don't need to look up because I know it the way I know my children's birthdays, and it had been professionally applied and had been, in my opinion and the opinion of everyone who had ever commented on it, a beautiful and entirely appropriate exterior color for a 1994 craftsman-influenced home in a neighborhood whose design ethos ran toward natural and neutral tones. Paulette Greer had been trying to change my paint color for 2 years. Her objection, which she had first raised through Millstone Crossing's online HOA complaint portal approximately 18 months before my hospitalization, was that the color was incongruent with the neighborhood's established warm neutral palette, and that it created what she called a visual disruption along the Heron Walk streetscape, a phrase that sounded more specific than it was, since Heron Walk's palette included at minimum 2 shades of green, a deep navy, and 3 different whites that were only technically the same color. The complaint had been reviewed by the HOA's management company, a firm called Meridian Property Group, and specifically by a property manager named Todd Abernathy, who had sent me a courtesy notice. And when I responded with documentation of the original color approval I'd received from a previous board before painting 4 years earlier, had confirmed in writing that my color had been approved under the existing governing documents, and that the complaint lacked the basis for a formal violation. The approval letter was on HOA letterhead, signed by the Architectural Review Committee chair at the time, confirming that the proposed color for my exterior repainting met the community's aesthetic standards. Todd had noted it, copied it into the complaint file, and closed the complaint as unfounded, sending confirmation to both Paulette and me. Paulette's response was to file a second complaint 4 months later, this time characterizing the color not as incongruent, but as faded and deteriorated beyond community standards, a reframing that attempted to sidestep the approval documentation by arguing not about the color itself, but about its current condition. Todd had come out and inspected and noted in his report that the paint showed normal weathering consistent with a 4-year-old exterior application and did not meet the standard for a deterioration violation under the governing documents, which required visible peeling, cracking, or damage affecting structural integrity, none of which was present. He'd taken photographs as part of his inspection and attached them to the report. The paint looked, in those photographs, like what it was, a 4-year-old exterior in good condition. The third complaint, filed about 6 months before my hospitalization, claimed that water damage visible on the east elevation had compromised the paint's protective function and required immediate remediation. Todd had again inspected, again found no water damage of the described character, and noted in his dismissal report that there was minor weathering on the east elevation consistent with normal sun and rain exposure, but not meeting the violation threshold, that the complaint appeared to describe the same paint in different terms rather than documenting a new condition, and that this was the third complaint filed about the same property in 18 months, all dismissed for the same underlying reason. I have wondered since whether that last sentence in Todd's report, his noting the pattern of complaints from the same source, had produced any reaction from Paulette when she received the dismissal, or whether it had simply confirmed to her that the administrative route had reached its limit and she needed a different approach. I believe it was the latter. I believe that the third dismissal, sometime in the spring of my hospitalization year, was the point at which Paulette Greer shifted from filing complaints to planning something else. 3 complaints, 3 dismissals, 2 years. And throughout this period, Paulette had spoken to me exactly twice in person, once to introduce herself when she became board president, and once, about 8 months before my hospitalization, when she had approached me at the annual community picnic and said, with a friendliness that didn't quite reach her eyes, that she hoped I was thinking about refreshing my exterior paint, that the neighborhood had been doing a lot of beautiful work, and that she thought Heron Walk specifically had an opportunity to really elevate its curb appeal. I had told her politely that I'd repainted 4 years ago, that the paint was in good condition, and that I was very happy with the color. She'd said she understood and moved on to talk to someone else. I was admitted to the hospital 4 months later on a Friday night after my daughter found me struggling to breathe and called an ambulance. The surgery happened 2 days after admission. The recovery required inpatient monitoring for another 3 weeks while my care team adjusted my medications and confirmed my cardiac function had stabilized. I was, in every meaningful sense, completely unavailable and completely vulnerable for 23 days. The painting crew arrived at my house on day 8. Alan Pugh, the retired teacher from 3 doors down who had become something of a street watchdog over the years, saw them come and called Camille, who was staying at my house, to collect my mail and water my plants. Camille called Todd Abernathy at Meridian Property Group and was told that the HOA had authorized an emergency paint remediation on my property under a provision in the governing documents allowing the association to address deteriorated exterior conditions when a homeowner was unavailable, and that the cost would be billed to the homeowner under the same provision. When Camille asked who had authorized this specific action, Todd said the board president had initiated the process, citing an outstanding unresolved violation complaint. When Camille pointed out that all 3 complaints had been dismissed, Todd said he was going to look into it and would call her back. He called back 2 days later and told Camille that the board had, at a meeting held 3 days before the crew arrived, voted to reclassify the existing complaint as an emergency remediation case on the basis of a new inspection report that had been submitted to the board by an unnamed inspector citing significant deterioration, and that this reclassification had authorized emergency action under Section 14.3 of the governing documents. The provision allowing the HOA to remediate urgent conditions on a member's property and bill the cost. Who performed the new inspection? Camille asked. Todd said the board had arranged it through the association's contractor relationship. Which contractor? Camille asked. Todd said Precision Coat Residential. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because Camille did, and then she said something that I later had framed and put on my desk because it was exactly right. You're telling me the company that inspected the property and found a problem is the same company that was then hired to fix the problem and is now billing $12,000 for that fix. Todd was quiet. And who arranged the contractor relationship between the HOA and Precision Coat? Camille asked. Todd said the board president was the contact for the contractor relationship. Camille came to the hospital that afternoon and sat in the chair beside my bed and held my hand and did not tell me any of this because she is a thoughtful and protective person, and she had correctly determined that none of this information should reach me while I was recovering from cardiac surgery. She told me there had been some work done on the house and that we'd deal with it when I was home. She handled the situation over the remaining 2 weeks of my hospitalization by documenting everything she could find and retaining an attorney without telling me until I was home and could receive the news while standing upright. When I walked up to my house in that light jacket on the Tuesday morning, Camille drove me home and saw the taupe and asked her whether she had known. She told me yes, and that she'd been handling it, and that she had some things to show me inside. We sat at my kitchen table, and she walked me through what she had: the invoice, the unauthorized signature, Todd Abernathy's emails documenting the complaint dismissal history, and then the sudden reclassification. The inspection report, which Camille had obtained through a records request to Meridian Property Group, which was a single page describing extensive paint failure across all elevations, and dated 3 days before the board vote, signed by a man named Craig Pollard of Precision Coat Residential, the same company that had submitted the $12,000 invoice. Craig Pollard, I said. I looked him up, Camille said. She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a printout from the State Business Registration Database. Precision Coat Residential, LLC. Registered 11 years earlier, registered agent Paulette Greer Pollard, owner of record Craig Pollard. Paulette Greer Pollard. The HOA board president, who had filed 3 complaints about my paint, lost all 3, had an unauthorized inspection performed by her own husband's company while I was in the hospital, convinced her board to reclassify the dismissed complaint as an emergency on the basis of her husband's inspection report, and then had her husband's company paint my house a color I hadn't chosen, sign my name to the authorization, and submit a $12,000 invoice to me. I looked at the paper for a long time, Camille watched me the way she'd been watching me since the surgery, with the careful attention of someone monitoring for signs of physical stress. I was not physically stressed. I was, in a very specific and clarifying way, entirely focused. "Who's the attorney you retained?" I asked. "Lionel Marsh," she said. "He does property and HOA litigation. He's been waiting for you to come home." I called Lionel that afternoon. He answered immediately, having apparently been told to expect my call, and said, "Mrs. Haynes, I have your file in front of me. I want you to know that in 21 years of HOA litigation, this is one of the cleaner fact patterns I've encountered, and by that I mean the evidence of what happened and who benefited from it is unusually explicit. How are you feeling physically? Because I want to make sure you're up for a conversation that covers quite a lot of ground." I told him I was fine. I told him I had just spent 23 days in the hospital recovering from heart surgery, and that I was more focused than I'd been in months, which was true, and that I wanted to know exactly what could be done and in what order. "Okay," Lionel said. "Let's start with the unauthorized signature, because that's the most immediately actionable piece and the one that establishes the criminal element of what happened before we even get to the civil side." He walked me through it for 45 minutes, and by the time we were done, I had a complete picture of every avenue available to me: the criminal complaint for the forged signature, the civil fraud and breach of fiduciary duty claims against Paulette personally, the civil negligence and breach of contract claims against the HOA for authorizing work without proper process, the State Contractor Licensing Board complaint against Precision Coat for performing work under a falsified authorization, and the HOA governance complaint that would eventually go before the full membership on the question of whether a board president who had directed HOA resources to her own husband's company while concealing that relationship from the board had violated her fiduciary obligations to the association. "Which of these do we start with?" I asked. "We start with all of them simultaneously," Lionel said. "I don't want to give her time to document a version of events that buries the connection between her and Precision Coat before we've established it formally in every relevant proceeding. The moment we file one thing, she's going to understand the full shape of what's coming. I want the full shape to arrive all at once." It arrived the following Monday. By Wednesday of that week, Paulette Greer had retained her own attorney, and Todd Abernathy at Meridian Property Group had placed himself on administrative leave pending an internal review. What happened after that, and how it ended, is a story about what happens when someone assumes that a sick neighbor and a forged signature will go unnoticed, and discovers, several months too late, that the neighbor recovered and brought a very thorough attorney with her.